For 7 months, the Duke of Ashworth had made Grace Bellamy the laughingstock of London society. At every ball, every soirée, every garden party, he turned his back when she entered a room, his jaw set with cold fury. Whispers followed her like ghosts. She had betrayed him, they said, broken their engagement for a richer match, destroyed his family's honor. Grace endured it all in silence, her head high, her eyes hollow. But what no one knew, what Edmund Ashworth himself did not know, was that the letter explaining everything, the letter that would absolve her of every accusation, had never reached his hands. Until now. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far it has traveled. Grace Bellamy had been raised to understand her place in the intricate machinery of English aristocracy. As the only daughter of Viscount Bellamy, a minor peer with respectable lineage but dwindling fortune, her future had been mapped before she could read. She would marry well, she would restore her family's standing, she would be grateful for whatever alliance her father secured. The Bellamy estate in Hampshire, though picturesque with its rolling lawns and ancient oak trees, bore the subtle marks of genteel decline. Paint peeled from window frames, carpets showed threadbare patches in the corridors, servants no longer walked. Grace had learned early not to ask for new dresses too often, not to question why her mother's jewelry gradually disappeared from the family vault. But on the morning of her 21st birthday, her father had summoned her to his study with news that changed everything. The Duke of Ashworth, young, handsome, recently elevated upon his father's death, had requested permission to court her. Edmund Ashworth was everything the ton admired, wealthy beyond measure, educated at Oxford, respected in Parliament, and possessed of a countenance that made debutantes swoon behind their fans. More importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in Grace herself, not merely the breeding potential of her bloodline. Their courtship had been a dream spun from spring sunshine and whispered promises. Edmund had taken her riding through Hyde Park, discussing philosophy and poetry rather than merely exchanging pleasantries. He had listened when she spoke of her passion for botanical illustration, had actually examined her watercolors with intelligent appreciation. At the Marlborough Ball, he had danced 3 sets with her, a scandal of favoritism that delighted the gossips, and later, in the torchlit garden, had kissed her hand with such reverence she had felt her heart might burst. "You are unlike anyone I have ever known," he had told her beneath a flowering magnolia tree, his dark eyes intense. "You see the world with such clarity, such compassion. I find myself wanting to be worthy of that vision." Grace had fallen helplessly, completely in love, not with his title or his fortune, but with the man who quoted Wordsworth during country walks, who debated social reform with genuine passion, who looked at her as though she were the most fascinating woman in England. The engagement had been announced in June, at the height of the season. Grace's mother had wept with relief. Her father had actually smiled. The Ashworth matriarch, the formidable Dowager Duchess, had welcomed Grace with measured approval, examining her as one might assess a promising filly. "You will make him happy," the Dowager had said, her tone making it simultaneously a prediction and a command. "He needs someone with intelligence and character, too many empty-headed girls throwing themselves at the title." Wedding preparations had consumed the summer. Grace had endured endless fittings for her trousseau, had memorized the labyrinthine connections of Edmund's family tree, had learned the particular rhythms of Ashworth Manor, the Duke's principal seat in Derbyshire, during a week-long visit that felt like a test she desperately hoped to pass. Edmund had been attentive throughout, stealing moments alone with her, despite the constant presence of chaperones. In the Ashworth Library, he had shown her his late father's collection of botanical texts, had ordered several rare volumes sent from London for her study. In the portrait gallery, he had introduced her to 3 centuries of Ashworth ancestors, with wry commentary that made her laugh. "This one gambled away half the estate," he had said, indicating a stern-faced gentleman from the Regency period. This one kept a menagerie in the East Wing that terrorized visiting bishops. And this one, he pointed to a formidable woman in Elizabethan dress, supposedly poisoned 2 husbands before they could prove she was smarter than they were. "Shall I be joining this gallery?" Grace had asked, her pulse quickening. "You will be the finest portrait here," Edmund had replied seriously, "and I shall commission it from the best artist in Europe." The wedding date had been set for late September, allowing time for relatives to return from summer travels. Grace's dress, a masterpiece of Brussels lace and silk, hung in her chamber like a promise. She had practiced writing her new signature, Grace Bellamy Ashworth, Duchess of Ashworth, until the letters flowed smoothly. But in late August, everything changed. Grace's younger brother, Thomas, had arrived home from Oxford in disgrace. At 19, he had always been reckless, prone to expensive amusements and poor judgment. But this time, he had entangled himself with a gambling syndicate run by a man named Victor Thorne, a wealthy American industrialist who had recently established himself in London society with ruthless ambition. Thorne was everything the English aristocracy pretended not to be. Openly mercenary, dismissive of tradition, interested only in expanding his influence and fortune. He had bought his way into clubs, into boardrooms, into the periphery of the ton through sheer financial power. And he had no patience for young aristocrats who couldn't pay their debts. Thomas owed him £15,000, a staggering sum that would bankrupt the Bellamys completely. Thorne had made his terms clear, payment in full within a fortnight, or he would not only pursue legal action, but would ensure the scandal destroyed what little remained of the family's reputation. More than that, he had connections to several newspapers. He would see the Bellamy name dragged through every gossip column in England. Grace's father had locked himself in his study for 2 days. Her mother had taken to her bed with laudanum and despair. Thomas had been simultaneously defiant and terrified, insisting he had been cheated but unable to prove it. Grace had gone to Edmund immediately. Surely he would help. He loved her. He had resources beyond imagining. A loan, discreetly arranged, would save her family without significantly impacting the Ashworth fortune. But when she arrived at Ashworth House in Mayfair, the butler had informed her his Grace was in meetings all day. She had left a note requesting an urgent audience. No response came. She tried again the next day, and the next, growing increasingly desperate as Thorne's deadline approached. Finally, on the 5th day, she had been granted 15 minutes in Edmund's study. He had been cordial but distracted, papers covering his desk, his secretary hovering nearby. When Grace explained the situation, watching Edmund's expression for the compassion she knew resided in his heart, she had instead witnessed something that chilled her. "Your brother made his choices," Edmund had said, his voice cooler than she had ever heard it. "The consequences are his to bear." "But it would destroy my family," Grace had whispered. "My father should have taught his son better discipline," Edmund had interrupted. "I am sorry, Grace, but I cannot enable such recklessness. It sets a poor precedent." "I am not asking you to enable anything," she had said, her hands trembling. "I am asking you to help the family you're about to join, my family." Edmund had looked at her then with something she couldn't decipher. Disappointment? Doubt. "I will not throw good money after bad judgment. Your brother's debts are not my responsibility." Grace had left that meeting feeling as though she walked through a nightmare. This cold stranger could not be the same man who had quoted poetry in moonlit gardens, who had looked at her with such tenderness. But Thorne's deadline was approaching, and Edmund had made his position clear. The Bellamys had no resources left to mortgage, no relatives wealthy enough to rescue them, no options except complete ruin. And then Victor Thorne had extended a different offer, one that made Grace's blood run cold, but seemed to present the only possible escape. He would forgive the debt entirely, and provide an additional sum to restore the Bellamy estate, if Grace agreed to break her engagement and marry him instead. The proposal, delivered through his solicitor, had been both shocking and calculated. Thorne wanted entry into the highest levels of aristocracy. Marriage to the Duke of Ashworth's former fiancée, a viscount's daughter with impeccable bloodline, despite her family's financial troubles, would provide exactly that. The scandal would only increase his notoriety, and Thorne thrived on notoriety. "It is utterly mad," her father had said when the proposal was explained. "The man is a monster. He is our only option," Grace had replied quietly, her decision already crystallizing into terrible certainty. She had written to Edmund one final time, explaining everything. The letter had been 12 pages long, written in tears and desperation. She explained Thomas's debt, Thorne's ultimatum, her repeated attempts to seek Edmund's help, and the impossible choice she now faced. She begged him to act, to save her, to prove that their love meant more than precedent or pride. She had entrusted the letter to her lady's maid, Annie, with strict instructions to deliver it directly to Edmund's hands, to wait for his response no matter how long it took. 3 days passed. No response came. Thorne's deadline expired, and Grace understood, with shattering clarity, that Edmund had received her letter and chosen not to act. He would let her be sacrificed rather than compromise his principles. On a grey morning in early September, Grace sent word to Edmund that their engagement was dissolved. No explanation, no apology. She could not bear to humiliate herself further with pleas he had already ignored. 24 hours later, she accepted Victor Thorne's proposal. The scandal erupted like wildfire through London society, consuming everything in its path. The news broke at the Pemberton Ball, one of the season's most anticipated events. Grace had not attended. She was too devastated to face society. But Edmund was there, and when the whispers reached him, the entire ballroom witnessed his reaction. According to accounts that spread through drawing rooms the next day, the Duke of Ashworth had gone absolutely rigid. His face had paled, then flushed with fury. He had left the ball immediately without taking leave of his hosts, a breach of etiquette so severe it only amplified the gossip. Within 48 hours, the narrative had solidified into something far worse than Grace could have imagined. She had not merely broken their engagement. According to the increasingly vicious rumors, she had been conducting a secret liaison with Victor Thorne throughout her courtship with Edmund. She had used the Duke's affections to elevate her social standing while planning all along to marry the wealthier American. She was a calculating opportunist who had deceived everyone, including the man who had loved her. Grace learned of these accusations through her mother's tears and her father's grim reports. She wanted to defend herself, to publish the truth, but Thorne's solicitors were clear. Any public statement would violate the terms of their agreement. Thorne owned her silence as surely as he was about to own her future. The wedding took place in mid-September at a London registry office, a stark contrast to the cathedral ceremony Grace had planned with Edmund. Thorne invited no guests except those required as witnesses. Grace wore a simple grey dress, her mother beside her weeping quietly, her father's face carved from stone. Thorne himself had been exactly as his reputation suggested, tall, sharp-featured, with cold blue eyes that assessed everything like inventory. He spoke little during the ceremony, signed the register with a flourish, and informed Grace they would be departing for his estate in Somerset immediately. "I have business in London for another month," he said as their carriage departed the city. "You will remain in Somerset until I send for you. Learn to manage the household. I expect efficiency." It was not a marriage. It was a business arrangement, and Grace understood she had been acquired like property. But the true nightmare began when Edmund launched his campaign of public contempt. At first, Grace thought distance would spare her the worst. Surely the ton would move on to fresher scandals. Surely Edmund would focus on his own life, perhaps find another bride to erase the humiliation she had inadvertently caused him. Instead, he seemed determined to ensure she never forgot what she had done. When Grace ventured into London in October for her mother's birthday, her first public appearance since the marriage, Edmund was at the same theatre. The moment he spotted her entering her box, he rose and departed, making certain his exit was conspicuous. The entire audience noted it. The gossip columns reported it the next morning. At a dinner party hosted by the Duchess of Marlborough in November, Edmund arrived after Grace was already seated. Upon seeing her, he requested a different dining room entirely, claiming he could not tolerate breathing the same air as a woman who had so thoroughly deceived him. Grace had fled before the first course was served, humiliated beyond bearing. In December, at a charity function Grace attended with her mother, Edmund delivered a speech about honor and integrity. He never mentioned her name, but his pointed glances in her direction made his target unmistakable. "There are those among us," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "who value gold above every other virtue, who would sacrifice truth, loyalty, and love itself for material gain. They walk among us wearing respectable faces, but their hearts are as false as counterfeit coin." Grace had sat frozen, every eye in the room upon her, as Edmund continued his barely veiled attack. When he finished, applause erupted, and Grace understood she had become the villain in a story she could not correct. The campaign continued through winter and into spring. Edmund never confronted her directly, never spoke to her, never acknowledged her existence except through conspicuous displays of contempt. But his message was unmistakable. Grace Bellamy, now Grace Thorne, was beneath his notice, unworthy even of his anger, deserving only of complete rejection. Society took its cue from the Duke of Ashworth. Invitations dwindled. Former friends cut her in public. Women she had known since childhood refused to acknowledge her. Grace became a ghost, haunting the edges of the ton, present but erased. Through it all, Victor Thorne remained largely absent. He spent most of his time in London or travelling to his various business interests. When he did visit Somerset, he treated Grace with cold indifference, reviewing household accounts, criticising expenditures, and leaving again within days. He showed no interest in her as a wife, only as a manager of his property. Grace found herself living in a beautiful prison. Thorne's Somerset estate was magnificent, a recently renovated mansion filled with expensive furnishings and modern conveniences. But Grace wandered its halls alone, her only companions the staff who regarded her with confused pity. She was a duchess in all but name, mistress of a grand house, and utterly, completely isolated. Her family visited twice. Her mother wept and apologized for the impossible situation. Her father looked 10 years older, the weight of his son's debt and daughter's sacrifice carved into his features. Thomas had gone to India, fleeing his shame or pursuing opportunity depending on one's perspective, and sent occasional letters that arrived months late. By March, Grace had developed a routine of mere survival. She woke, managed the household, walked the gardens, painted botanical studies in her sitting room, and retired early. She read novels where heroines faced adversity and emerged triumphant. She wondered if her own story would ever contain anything beyond this grey existence. And in London, Edmund continued his subtle, devastating campaign. At the Cavendish Ball in April, he danced with every eligible young woman in attendance, a public declaration that he had moved past his broken engagement and was ready to consider new matches. The newspapers speculated about his prospects. The matchmaking mamas circled like sharks scenting blood. Grace read about it in the society pages and felt the wound deepen. This was what she had become to him, not even worth his hatred, only his dismissal. The man who had once looked at her with such love now could not bear to occupy the same room, and she could do nothing to explain, nothing to defend herself, nothing but endure. In May, the season reached its peak, and Grace steeled herself for another round of social torture. Thorne had commanded her presence at several high-profile events. He wanted his wife displayed as evidence of his social ascent. Grace had no choice but to obey, to dress in the expensive gowns he provided, to wear the diamonds he had purchased, and to face Edmund's cold rejection again and again. The breaking point came at the Ashworth matriarch's annual garden party in late May, an event Grace had expected to avoid, but which Thorne insisted she attend precisely because it would cause maximum discomfort. Edmund was the host, naturally. Grace arrived late, hoping to remain inconspicuous, but the Dowager Duchess spotted her immediately. The elderly woman's face hardened with disappointment and disapproval. She turned away without greeting, her cut deliberate and devastating. And then Edmund himself appeared on the terrace above the lawn, looking directly at Grace. For a moment, one breathless, impossible moment, something flickered in his dark eyes. Pain, longing, but it vanished instantly, replaced by that familiar ice. He descended the steps, walked directly past her as though she were invisible, and engaged a beautiful blonde debutante in animated conversation. Grace stood amid the flowering gardens she had once imagined presiding over as Duchess, wearing another man's diamonds, carrying the weight of a sacrifice no one knew she had made, and understood that this was her life now. Not temporary, not something time would heal. This was the permanent consequence of her choice. She left the party before the first course was served, claimed illness, and returned to Somerset. That night, alone in her chambers, Grace finally allowed herself to weep for the love she had lost, for the man who despised her, for the future that should have been hers, and for the truth trapped inside her like a scream she could never release. 7 months had passed since she had sent that desperate letter to Edmund. 7 months of public contempt, social exile, and lonely misery. And still, she could not regret her choice. Thomas was safe, her family was secure. That had to be enough, even if it cost her everything else. But in the deepest hours of that night, Grace wondered how much longer she could endure being hated by the only man she had ever loved, for a sacrifice he would never know she had made. By June, Grace had reached a breaking point. The isolation, the contempt, the crushing weight of her secret, all of it had become unbearable. She wrote to her Aunt Cordelia, her mother's elder sister, who lived in Bath, and had always been the family's most independent thinker. Aunt Cordelia's response arrived within the week. Come at once. Bring only what matters. Leave the rest behind. Grace did not ask Victor Thorne's permission. She simply informed him by letter that she would be spending the summer in Bath for her health. His reply, terse and indifferent, granted approval with the condition that she maintain appropriate appearances and return if he required her presence. He clearly cared more about her utility than her whereabouts. Bath in June was transformed from the fashionable resort of the season into something quieter and more genuine. The pump rooms still attracted visitors, but they were scholars and invalids rather than social climbers. The assemblies continued, but with less pretension, and Aunt Cordelia inhabited this world perfectly. Cordelia Ashford was 62, unmarried by choice, and magnificently unconcerned with social conventions that did not interest her. She lived in an elegant townhouse near the Royal Crescent, filled with books, scientific instruments, and visiting intellectuals. She hosted a weekly salon where ideas mattered more than titles. "You look half dead," Cordelia announced when Grace arrived, examining her with shrewd grey eyes. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" "I'm not certain," Grace admitted. "And when did you last have a conversation about something other than scandal and shame?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I cannot remember." Cordelia embraced her fiercely. "Then we shall remedy both immediately. You will eat, you will rest, and then you will remember who you were before that impossible situation destroyed you." The first week, Grace did little except sleep and weep. Cordelia asked no questions, demanded no explanations, simply provided sanctuary. She brought Grace meals, sat with her during nightmares, and gradually, patiently, drew her back towards something resembling life. "You made an impossible choice," Cordelia said one evening as they took tea in her garden. "I do not know the details, and you need not share them unless you wish. But I know you, Grace. You have never been mercenary or cruel. Whatever happened, you had reasons. "No one else believes that," Grace whispered. "Then everyone else is a fool," Cordelia replied crisply. "The ton is composed largely of fools, which is why I prefer Bath. Here we have actual thinkers." It was through Cordelia's salon that Grace began tentatively to re-engage with the world. The gatherings included university professors, writers, reformers, and artists. They debated philosophy, discussed scientific discoveries, analyzed literature, and argued politics with passionate intensity. Grace attended the first salon reluctantly, prepared to be recognized and rejected. Instead, she found herself treated as an intelligent person rather than a social curiosity. A botanist from Edinburgh asked her opinion on cross-pollination techniques. A female novelist listened with genuine interest as Grace described her watercolor studies. A physician engaged her in discussion about the medicinal properties of various plants. "Your insights are remarkably sophisticated," the botanist Dr. William Morrison said with approval. "Have you considered publishing your observations?" Grace stared at him. "I am a woman and a controversial figure." "You are a scientist," Dr. Morrison corrected. "Gender is irrelevant to truth, and society's opinion even more so. If your work has merit, and from what you describe it does, then it deserves recognition." The idea was so foreign, so impossibly distant from the world Grace had inhabited, that she barely knew how to process it. But something stirred inside her, a forgotten ambition, a suppressed passion. Through June and into July, Grace attended every salon. She began working seriously on her botanical studies again, not as mere pastime, but as genuine research. Dr. Morrison offered guidance and access to his own library. Cordelia provided funding for supplies and books. Grace felt parts of herself reawakening that she thought had died in Somerset. It was at a salon in mid-July that Grace met Dr. Elias Thornfield. He arrived as a guest of Dr. Morrison, recently returned from 3 years studying tropical diseases in West Africa. He was perhaps 35, tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and intelligent hazel eyes that missed nothing. He spoke with quiet authority about his research, refusing to romanticize the difficult conditions or the lives lost. "Medicine should serve humanity," he said in response to a question about his motivations. "Not merely those who can afford private physicians, but everyone. Disease does not respect class distinctions, neither should healing." Grace found herself deeply moved by his conviction. After the salon, as guests mingled in Cordelia's garden, Dr. Thornfield approached her. "Mrs. Thorne, I understand you are studying medicinal botany," he said. "Dr. Morrison speaks highly of your work." "He is generous," Grace replied, startled to be addressed directly by this impressive figure. "He is precise," Elias corrected, "which is why his praise carries weight. I wonder if you might be interested in collaborating on a project I am developing, a comprehensive study of English medicinal plants and their properties, with particular focus on accessibility for rural practitioners." Grace's heart raced. "You are serious?" "Entirely. I need someone with botanical expertise and artistic skill to document specimens accurately. Morrison suggested you might be ideal." For the first time in months, Grace felt something other than despair. "I would be honored." Over the following weeks, Grace and Elias worked together regularly. They explored the countryside around Bath, collecting specimens. Grace created detailed watercolor studies, while Elias documented medicinal properties and traditional uses. Their collaboration was intellectual and professional, but Grace found herself drawn to his calm competence, his lack of judgment about her past, his genuine respect for her abilities. Elias never asked about her marriage or the scandal that had preceded it. He treated her as a colleague, an equal partner in their research. When she made an insightful observation, he acknowledged it. When she questioned his conclusions, he listened and adjusted his thinking. "You have a scientific mind," he told her one afternoon as they examined specimens in Cordelia's conservatory. "Precise observation, careful analysis, willingness to question assumptions. It is rare and valuable." "I was trained to be ornamental, not useful," Grace replied with involuntary bitterness. Elias looked at her seriously. "Then your training was inadequate. You are clearly both." The compliment, so simply delivered, brought unexpected tears to Grace's eyes. Elias noticed immediately and looked horrified. "Forgive me. I did not mean to cause distress." "You did not," Grace managed. "You have no idea how long it has been since anyone suggested I might have value beyond my family connections or my husband's property." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "I know nothing of your circumstances, Mrs. Thorne, except what I have observed. And what I observe is an intelligent, talented woman whose gifts have been thoroughly underestimated. Whatever else may be true, that assessment stands independent of any other consideration." Grace carried those words like a talisman through the remainder of July. She began sleeping through the night. She laughed at Cordelia's wry observations. She felt her spine straightening, her confidence returning incrementally. But in August, London society began arriving in Bath for the late summer season, and Grace's fragile peace shattered. The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth maintained a house in Bath for taking the waters. When she arrived in early August, the entire social dynamic shifted. Suddenly, Grace was no longer anonymous. She was recognized, whispered about, subjected to renewed scrutiny. And then, disastrously, Edmund arrived. Grace learned of his presence from Cordelia, who had heard it at the pump room. "The Duke is here," Cordelia said gently, "accompanying his mother for her health. I thought you should know." Grace's first instinct was to flee back to Somerset, but Elias was expecting her at the laboratory they had established in Dr. Morrison's house. Their research was reaching a critical phase, and Grace realized, with sudden clarity, that she was finished running. "I will not hide," she told Cordelia. "I have done nothing wrong, and I will not be driven from the first place I have found peace." Cordelia smiled with fierce approval. "That is the Grace I remember." The inevitable encounter occurred 3 days later, at the pump room. Grace was there with Elias, discussing their plans to present their research to the Royal Society. She wore a simple morning dress of lavender muslin, her face free of the heavy cosmetics society demanded, her manner relaxed. And then Edmund walked in. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Grace watched shock register on his features, shock and something more complicated. She looked different than he remembered, thinner, certainly, but also somehow stronger, more present, less like a beautiful ornament and more like a woman with purpose. Edmund started toward her, his expression dark. Grace's pulse hammered, but she held her ground. And then Elias noticed her distress and moved subtly closer, a gesture of support rather than possession. Edmund registered the proximity, and his face hardened further. He changed direction abruptly and left the pump room without speaking to anyone. "Someone you know?" Elias asked quietly. "Someone I used to know," Grace replied, her voice remarkably steady. "A lifetime ago." But that night, alone in her chamber, Grace could not stop thinking about Edmund's face. For just a moment before anger reasserted itself, she had seen something else. Something that looked almost like longing. It was impossible, she told herself. He despised her. 7 months of public contempt had proven that decisively. Whatever she thought she had seen was merely projection of her own persistent, foolish feelings. But doubt had been planted, and Grace began to wonder for the first time whether the story she believed might not be complete. And Cordelia hosted a special salon in late August, celebrating the anticipated publication of Grace and Elias's medicinal plant research in a respected scientific journal. It was an informal gathering, mostly their collaborators and friends. But Cordelia had also invited several prominent figures from Bath society to demonstrate that intellectual achievement transcended scandal. Grace, dressed carefully in a gown of deep emerald silk, one of the few truly beautiful things she owned that Thorne had not purchased. She arranged her honey-blonde hair simply, with none of the elaborate styling society demanded. She looked She thought, like herself, rather than a role she was playing. The salon was proceeding beautifully. Dr. Morrison gave a gracious speech about Grace's contributions. Elias presented their findings with characteristic precision, acknowledging Grace's essential role at every turn. And then, midway through the evening, the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth arrived, with Edmund in tow. Cordelia greeted them with perfect composure, as though she had expected them. "Your Grace, Duke Ashworth, how lovely you could join us. We are celebrating scientific collaboration this evening. I trust you have interest in medicinal botany?" The Dowager's shrewd eyes swept the room, landing on Grace with unreadable assessment. "I have interest in all manner of unexpected developments, Lady Ashford." Edmund said nothing, but his gaze found Grace immediately. She met his eyes steadily, refusing to flinch or retreat. Cordelia, magnificent in her social maneuvering, guided the Dowager toward Dr. Morrison for conversation about his work. This left Edmund standing awkwardly near the refreshment table, clearly present under maternal obligation rather than personal interest. Grace considered leaving. Instead, she found herself walking directly toward him. "Your Grace," she said quietly, offering a precise curtsy. Edmund stiffened. For a moment, she thought he would turn away as he always did, but perhaps the setting, or his mother's presence, constrained him. "Mrs. Thorne," he replied, his voice cold. "I understand your presence here makes you uncomfortable," Grace continued, keeping her voice low enough that others could not overhear. "I can depart if—" "You seem quite comfortable yourself," Edmund interrupted, his tone edged with bitterness. "Scientific pursuits suit you well, I see, as does the company of Dr. Thornfield." Grace felt anger flare, the first genuine anger she had allowed herself in months. "Dr. Thornfield is a colleague and a friend. He treats me as though I possess intelligence and worth. I find it refreshing. How convenient that you discovered your scientific ambitions after securing your wealthy marriage," Edmund said, his words cutting. "I suppose Thorne's fortune provides excellent freedom to pursue whatever interests suit your convenience." "You know nothing about my marriage," Grace replied, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. "Nothing about my life or my choices. You have judged me based on assumptions, and I judged you based on your actions," Edmund shot back. "You destroyed our engagement for greater fortune. The facts speak clearly." "The facts," Grace repeated, something breaking inside her. "You speak of facts when you know nothing, when you refuse to even—" She stopped, remembering Thorne's lawyers, the terms of her agreement. She could not defend herself without violating the contract that had saved her family. Edmund saw her hesitation and interpreted it as guilt. "You have nothing to say, because there is nothing to be said. You made your choice. You must live with it, as must I." "Yes," Grace whispered, her anger draining into exhausted sadness. "We must both live with choices we did not wish to make." Something flickered in Edmund's eyes. Confusion, perhaps, or unwilling curiosity. But before he could respond, Elias appeared at Grace's elbow. "Mrs. Thorne, Dr. Morrison wishes to introduce you to Sir Reginald Hawthorne from the Royal Society," he said smoothly, then added with perfect courtesy, "Your Grace, good evening." Edmund's jaw tightened. He gave the briefest of nods and walked away. Elias studied Grace's face with concern. "Are you well?" "I am well enough," Grace replied, though her hands trembled. "Thank you for the rescue." "It appeared necessary," Elias said quietly. Then, after a pause, "He was your fiancé, I understand, before your current marriage." Grace looked at him in surprise. "Cordelia mentioned it," Elias explained. "She thought I should understand the context. I hope you do not mind." "What else did she tell you?" Grace asked warily. "Nothing except that the situation was far more complicated than society understands, and that you made a sacrifice that cost you dearly." Elias met her eyes directly. "I do not need details to recognize courage when I see it, Grace." It was the first time he had used her given name. Something warm unfurled in Grace's chest. Not romance exactly, but recognition. This man saw her clearly and respected what he saw. "Thank you," she managed. The evening concluded without further confrontation, but Grace felt emotionally battered. The dowager departed with Edmund, but not before pausing to speak quietly with Grace. "You look different than you did in London," the elderly woman observed. "Stronger, less like a victim." "Perhaps because I have stopped accepting that role, Your Grace," Grace replied honestly. The dowager's lips twitched with what might have been approval. "My son is a stubborn fool when he believes himself wronged, but he is not fundamentally unjust. If there was something he did not understand—" "There is much he does not understand," Grace interrupted gently, "but I am bound from explaining it. That is my burden to carry, not his." The dowager studied her for a long moment. "You still love him?" It was not a question. Grace saw no purpose in denying it. "I will always love who he was to me, but that man no longer exists, and I have learned to live without him." "Have you?" the dowager asked softly. "Or are you merely becoming skilled at pretending?" She departed before Grace could answer, leaving her shaken by the perceptiveness of the observation. That night, Grace walked in Cordelia's garden, unable to sleep. Elias found her there near midnight, having noticed her absence from the house. "I could not stop thinking about our exchange with the Duke," he said, settling on the bench beside her. "About what he said regarding your marriage." "It does not matter what he thinks," Grace replied wearily. "It clearly matters to you," Elias countered, "and I find myself curious about something. If you could explain the truth to him, if there were no constraints preventing it, would you?" Grace considered the question seriously. Would she? What would she say? That she had broken their engagement to save her family from ruin? That Edmund himself had refused to help, making her choice inevitable? That she had sent him a letter explaining everything, a letter he had apparently ignored? "I honestly do not know," she finally answered. "The truth would explain my actions, but would also reveal his inaction. It would absolve me while condemning him. I am not certain either of us would benefit." "Perhaps not," Elias agreed. "But consider this. Might he have refused to help because he did not fully understand the desperation of your circumstances? Men of his class often cannot imagine true financial ruin. It is so far outside their experience." "I explained it clearly," Grace protested. "In person or in a letter?" Grace froze. "In a letter. A very detailed letter that I sent before I accepted Thorne's proposal." "And you are certain he received it?" Elias asked carefully. "It was delivered to Ashworth House. My maid took it directly to—" Grace stopped, her mind racing. "To the butler, because Edmund was not at home." "Butler," Elias repeated. "Not Edmund's hands directly. Annie said she gave it to the head butler, who promised to deliver it immediately to his Grace." Grace felt her pulse accelerating. "Are you suggesting—" "I am suggesting that large households are complex operations and correspondence can go astray," Elias said, "particularly if someone had reason to intercept it." Grace stared at him, a terrible possibility taking shape. If Edmund had never received her letter, if he had no idea why she broke their engagement, no understanding of her desperate circumstances or her sacrifice, then his anger, his contempt, his public rejection all made horrible sense. "He thinks I simply chose Thorne's wealth over our love," she whispered. "He has no idea about Thomas's debt, or Thorne's ultimatum, or my attempts to ask his help. He knows none of it." "If the letter never reached him," Elias confirmed, "then he knows only what society knows, and society has crafted a damning narrative." Grace stood abruptly, her mind whirling. "I must speak with Annie. She's the only person who knows exactly what happened to that letter." "Where is she now?" Elias asked. "Still employed by my mother, I believe, in Hampshire." Grace turned to Elias, desperation rising. "I must go there, immediately. If there is any chance that Edmund does not know the truth, then you must discover what happened to your letter," Elias finished. "And if he never received it, you must find a way to tell him." "But Thorne's contract forbids me from making public statements," Grace said, frustration mounting. "I cannot simply explain—" "A private letter to Edmund would not be a public statement," Elias pointed out. And if you are asked, you could honestly say you sent it months ago. The timing would support the truth. Hope, dangerous and painful, blazed to life in Grace's chest. She looked at Elias with overwhelming gratitude. "Why are you helping me pursue the man I still love?" Elias smiled sadly. "Because you deserve happiness, Grace. And because true love, the kind worth preserving, is rarer and more valuable than my own feelings. I care for you deeply, but I recognize what I see when you speak of him. That is not something I would stand in the way of, even if I wished to." Grace embraced him impulsively. "You are a far better man than society deserves, which is why I prefer scientific circles," Elias replied dryly. "We shall travel to Hampshire tomorrow. Cordelia will accompany us for propriety, and we will uncover what happened to your letter." As Grace finally slept that night, for the first time in 7 months, she felt something other than despair. She felt hope, fragile and terrifying, but undeniably present. If Edmund had never received her explanation, then everything she believed about his character, his love, and their destroyed future might still be salvageable. And if he had received it and chosen not to act, then at least she would know with certainty that her love had been misplaced. Either way, she would finally have truth instead of torment. Tomorrow, she would begin discovering which version of reality was real. The journey to Hampshire took most of the day, providing ample time for Grace's hopes to oscillate between desperate optimism and crushing doubt. What if Annie confirmed the letter had been delivered properly? What if Edmund had received every word and simply deemed Grace's circumstances unworthy of his intervention? Then Grace would be left with the terrible knowledge that the man she loved was not who she believed him to be. But if the letter had gone astray, if some accident or intentional interference had prevented it from reaching Edmund, then 7 months of misery, contempt, and suffering had been built on a foundation of miscommunication. The thought was almost too painful to bear. Cordelia sat across from her in the carriage, observing Grace's internal turmoil with sympathetic silence. Elias rode alongside on horseback, giving the women privacy for conversation if needed. "Whatever you discover," Cordelia finally said, as the familiar Hampshire countryside came into view, "you will survive it. You have already survived far worse. Truth, even painful truth, is preferable to the limbo you have been inhabiting." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. The Bellamy estate appeared smaller than Grace remembered, though still beautiful in the golden late summer light. Her mother received them with surprise and delight, embracing Grace with tears of relief. "You look so much better than when I last saw you," Lady Bellamy said, studying her daughter's face. "Bath has been good for you." "Aunt Cordelia has been good for me," Grace corrected. "But I have not come merely for a visit. I need to speak with Annie urgently." "Is she still in your employ?" Lady Bellamy's expression shifted to confusion. "Annie? Your former lady's maid? My dear, Annie is no longer with us. She left service shortly after your wedding, quite suddenly, I might add. She claimed a family emergency in Cornwall." Grace felt her stomach drop. Cornwall. But Annie's family was from Kent. She had no connections in Cornwall that I knew of. "That is what seemed odd to me as well," Lady Bellamy agreed. "And she was quite insistent on departing immediately, would not even stay to collect a full quarter's wages. She seemed almost frightened." Grace and Cordelia exchanged significant glances. "Did she leave a forwarding address?" Grace asked urgently. "None that I recall," Lady Bellamy replied. "But Mrs. Henshaw might remember. She handles the household accounts. Shall I send for her?" The housekeeper arrived within minutes. A stout woman who had managed the Bellamy household for 30 years. She remembered Annie's departure clearly. "Strange business that was," Mrs. Henshaw said. "The girl received a visitor late one evening, a gentleman, though he would not give his name. After that, she came to me white as a sheet, said she needed to depart immediately for a family crisis. I tried to persuade her to wait until morning at least, but she insisted on leaving that very night, took only what she could carry in one bag." "A gentleman visitor?" Grace repeated, her heart racing. "Did you see him?" "Only from a distance, miss. Forgive me, Mrs. Thorne. But he was well dressed, I can tell you that. Quality clothes. Not the sort that typically calls on ladies' maids through the servants' entrance." Grace felt pieces clicking into place. "When did this occur, Mrs. Henshaw?" "Precisely?" The housekeeper consulted her mental calendar. "It would have been late September, just after your wedding, perhaps the 21st or 22nd, exactly when Annie should have been returning from delivering the letter to Edmund." Grace felt her blood run cold. "Thank you, Mrs. Henshaw," Cordelia interjected smoothly. "You have been most helpful." After the housekeeper departed, Grace paced her mother's sitting room like a caged animal. Someone intercepted her. Someone paid her or threatened her into leaving service and disappearing. But who and why? Who would benefit from ensuring Edmund never received your explanation? Cordelia asked pointedly. Grace thought frantically. Victor Thorne would benefit. He secured me as his wife. But how would he even know about the letter? I told no one except Annie. Ashworth House would know, Elias suggested, having joined them after stabling his horse. If Annie delivered the letter there, someone in that household would have been aware of it. "The Dowager," Grace said doubtfully. "She is formidable, but I cannot imagine her intercepting correspondence to her own son." "Not the Dowager," Cordelia said slowly. "But what about someone who served the previous duke? Someone whose position or interest might be threatened by Edmund's marriage?" Grace's mind raced through the staff at Ashworth House. The butler, Carstairs, had served the family for 40 years. Edmund's valet, Thomas Wright, was utterly devoted. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, had... Grace stopped abruptly. Mrs. Pemberton. She was the previous duke's housekeeper, but Edmund retained her despite their difficult relationship. She believed he was too reformist, too willing to change traditional practices. And she mentioned once that she had hoped he would marry Lady Charlotte Waverley, whose family was much more conservative. "Motive," Elias said quietly. "If she believed your influence would push Edmund toward more progressive views, she might have had reason to prevent the marriage. But to intercept a letter, to pay off a lady's maid..." Grace shook her head. "That suggests resources beyond a housekeeper's means. Unless she was acting on behalf of someone else," Cordelia pointed out. "Someone with both motive and resources." Grace felt understanding dawn with sickening clarity. "Lady Charlotte Waverley. Her father is Viscount with significant holdings. She has been pursuing Edmund for years. If someone approached her with information about my desperate letter, offered to prevent it from reaching Edmund in exchange for compensation, she would have every reason to agree," Cordelia finished. "You would be eliminated as competition. Edmund would believe you betrayed him, and Lady Charlotte would be positioned as his consolation." "But this is all speculation," Grace protested. "We have no proof." "Then we must find Annie," Elias stated firmly. "She is the only person who knows exactly what transpired." Over the next week, they pursued every possible lead. Grace's father used his remaining connections to inquire about Annie's whereabouts. Cordelia hired a discreet investigator. Elias travelled to Kent to interview Annie's actual family, discovering they had received no word from her in months and were increasingly worried. The break came from an unexpected source. Lady Bellamy remembered that Annie had a cousin who worked at an inn near Plymouth. A letter to that establishment eventually reached someone who had seen a young woman matching Annie's description working at a boarding house in a small Cornish fishing village. By mid-September, Grace, Cordelia, and Elias were travelling to Cornwall. The boarding house was a modest establishment overlooking a grey sea. The proprietress initially denied knowing anyone named Annie, but when Grace described her former maid in detail, recognition flickered in the woman's eyes. "She calls herself Anne Miller now," the proprietress admitted. "Works in the kitchen, keeps to herself, seems frightened of her own shadow. If you mean her harm, we mean her none," Grace assured. "I am her former employer. I need desperately to speak with her about a matter that affects both our futures." Annie was fetched from the kitchen, and when she saw Grace, she burst into tears. "Oh, Miss Grace," Forgive me, Mrs. Thorne. I am so sorry. I tried to protect you. I did what I thought was right, but then they came, and I was so frightened." Grace embraced her, feeling the girl's trembling. "Annie, calm yourself. I am not angry, but I must know what happened to the letter I gave you." "The letter for the Duke of Ashworth." Annie's tears intensified. "I delivered it just as you said, miss. Took it directly to Ashworth House, handed it to Mr. Carstairs himself, made him promise to give it straight to his Grace. He swore he would." "But did Edmund receive it?" Grace pressed gently. Annie shook her head miserably. "I don't know, miss. Because 2 days later, a lady came to the Bellamy house asking to see me private-like. Said she was a friend of yours, though I did not recognize her. Beautiful lady, blonde hair, very fine clothes." "Lady Charlotte Waverley," Grace breathed. "She did not give her name," Annie continued. "But she said she knew about the letter, said it contained private matters that would humiliate you if they became public. She said his Grace had received it, and was so disgusted by your circumstances, your brother's gambling, your family's debts, that he wanted nothing more to do with you. She said he had burned the letter rather than keep such shameful things in his house." Grace closed her eyes in anguish. "And you believed her." "She was so convincing, miss," Annie wept. "And she said if I truly cared for you, I would not speak of the letter to anyone. She said it would only spread the humiliation further. Then she gave me £20, more money than I had seen in my life, and said I should leave the area, start fresh somewhere. My association with your scandal would not follow me." "And the gentleman who visited you the night you left?" Cordelia asked. "He came from Lady Charlotte," Annie admitted. "Said she had heard I was still at the Bellamy house, and she needed me to leave immediately before I accidentally revealed things better left buried. He was not threatening exactly, but I understood that I should not refuse." "So you came here," Grace said gently, "and have been hiding ever since." "I thought I was protecting you," Annie whispered. "I thought his Grace had rejected you completely, and speaking about the letter would only make things worse. But Mrs. Thorne, if I did wrong, if I made things harder for you, I am so terribly sorry." Grace held her former maid close. "You were manipulated, Annie, by someone with far more power and resources than you could possibly resist. You are not to blame." But as Grace spoke those reassuring words, rage built inside her. Lady Charlotte Waverley had deliberately intercepted her explanation, had paid off her maid, had ensured Edmund remained ignorant of the truth. She had allowed, no, actively encouraged, 7 months of suffering, public humiliation, and destroyed love. "What will you do now?" Elias asked quietly as they prepared to depart Cornwall, leaving Annie with funds to establish herself properly. Grace's expression was steel beneath silk. "I will write to Edmund. I will explain everything. The debt, Thorne's ultimatum, my attempts to seek his help, the letter that was intercepted, all of it. And then I will return to Bath and wait to see if the man I loved still exists beneath 7 months of manufactured hatred." "Yeah, and if he does not believe you?" Cordelia asked. "Then at least I will know I tried," Grace replied. "I will have the truth, even if he rejects it. That is more than I have had these past months." That night, in a Cornwall inn overlooking the sea, Grace wrote the most important letter of her life. She detailed Thomas's debt, Victor Thorne's cruel bargain, her desperate attempts to seek Edmund's help, and the letter she had sent that he had never received. She explained Lady Charlotte's interference, Annie's manipulation, and the 7 months of suffering they had both endured based on lies. "I broke our engagement to save my family from ruin," she wrote. "I married Victor Thorne not because I desired his wealth, but because I had no other choice. Every day since, I have mourned the loss of you, of us, of the future we should have shared. If you received my first letter and chose not to act, then I misjudged your character and must bear that knowledge. But if you never knew the truth, if Lady Charlotte's machinations succeeded in keeping you ignorant, then I am writing now to give you what you should have had months ago, the ability to judge me based on truth rather than deception. I do not ask your forgiveness. I do not expect your renewed affection. I ask only that you know the truth, so that both of us may finally understand what was done to us and why. She signed it simply Grace, sealed it with her personal crest, and entrusted it to Elias for delivery directly to Edmund's hands. No butler, no household staff, no possibility of interception. As they departed Cornwall, Grace felt simultaneously terrified and liberated. The truth was finally travelling toward Edmund. Whether he believed it, whether he still cared, whether anything could be salvaged from 7 months of lies, none of that she could control. But she had done what she could. The rest belonged to fate, to Edmund, and to whatever capacity for forgiveness might still exist in the man she had never stopped loving. Edmund Ashworth received Grace's letter on a grey September morning at his London townhouse. He recognized her handwriting immediately on the envelope and nearly threw it into the fire unread. 7 months had not diminished his anger, or so he told himself. 7 months of seeing her at social events with that quiet strength that somehow made her more beautiful, of watching her laugh at another man's conversation, of knowing she had chosen wealth over love. But something made him break the seal. Perhaps the weight of the envelope, suggesting multiple pages. Perhaps the memory of her face at the bath pump room, where she had looked simultaneously haunted and stronger than he remembered. Perhaps merely the self-destructive impulse that had characterized much of his year. He read, standing at his study window, the morning light cold and clear, and with each paragraph his carefully maintained fury crumbled into horror, then anguish, then burning rage, not at Grace, but at his own blindness and Lady Charlotte's calculated cruelty. Thomas's gambling debt, Thorne's ultimatum, Grace's desperate attempts to seek his help, attempts he dimly remembered dismissing in the chaos of parliamentary sessions and estate business, assuming her concern was overstated. The letter she had sent explaining everything, the letter he had never received because it had never reached him. Edmund sank into his chair, Grace's words blurring before him. She had sacrificed herself to save her family. She had come to him for help, and he had turned her away. She had tried to explain, and his own household staff, or someone with access to them, had prevented the explanation from reaching him. And he had spent 7 months punishing her for a betrayal that had never occurred. The letter concluded with a request that nearly destroyed him. I ask only that you know the truth, so that both of us may finally understand what was done to us and why. She was not begging forgiveness. She was not asking him to rescue her. She was simply offering truth, and in that offering, revealing the depth of her sacrifice and the magnitude of his failure. Edmund stood abruptly, calling for his secretary, his valet, his carriage. He needed to speak with Carstairs immediately. If a letter had been delivered to Ashworth House and never reached him, the butler would know. Carstairs, when summoned, looked increasingly uncomfortable, as Edmund described the missing correspondence. Your Grace, a letter from Miss Bellamy, forgive me, Mrs. Thorne, was indeed delivered in early September of last year. I received it personally from her lady's maid. And what became of it? Edmund demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. I placed it on the silver salver in your study with other correspondence, Your Grace, as is standard procedure. But I never saw it, Edmund said, which means someone removed it between your delivery and my review. Who had access to my study that day? Carstairs hesitated, loyalty warring with honesty. Mrs. Pemberton was in your study that afternoon, Your Grace, supervising the maids in their cleaning. I believe Lady Charlotte Waverley also called that day and waited briefly in your study for you to return from your meeting. Edmund felt fury ignite. Fetch me the household records for that week, and send word to Lady Charlotte that I require her immediate presence. I do not care what previous engagements she has. Within an hour, Edmund had reconstructed the probable timeline. His housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, had likely removed the letter. Her conservative views and disapproval of Grace's reformist influence on Edmund had been barely concealed. She had probably intended to dispose of it herself, but Lady Charlotte's fortuitous visit had provided an even better solution. Charlotte had taken the letter, read it, and recognized a perfect opportunity to eliminate her romantic rival. When Lady Charlotte arrived at Edmund's townhouse, she was dressed immaculately and smiling with confidence. "Edmund, darling, your note sounded so urgent. What, did you intercept a letter addressed to me from Grace Bellamy last September?" Edmund interrupted, his voice cold. Charlotte's smile faltered. "I do not know what did you," Edmund repeated with icy precision. "Remove correspondence from my study, read my private letters, and then pay off the sender's maid to ensure I remained ignorant of its contents." Charlotte's face paled. "Edmund, if you would allow me to explain—" "Explain?" Edmund's voice rose with barely controlled rage. "Explain how you deliberately destroyed my engagement, manipulated an innocent woman servant, and allowed me to spend 7 months believing the woman I loved had betrayed me? Explain how your selfish ambition caused suffering to multiple innocent people." "I did it because I love you," Charlotte cried, her composure shattering. "You were wasting yourself on that insignificant girl. She was weak, desperate, completely inappropriate for a man of your standing. I knew if you understood her family's true circumstances, the gambling debts, the poverty, you would recognize how unsuitable she was. So you decided for me," Edmund said, his tone now dangerously quiet. "You intercepted her explanation, ensured I never knew the truth, and allowed me to believe she had chosen wealth over love. You let me condemn her publicly for months, let me destroy her reputation further, all while knowing she was innocent." "She's married to Victor Thorne," Charlotte protested. "Whatever her reasons, she married him. You cannot simply—" "She married him because I refused to help her when she desperately needed me," Edmund interrupted, "because I was too proud, too dismissive of circumstances I did not understand. She came to me for assistance, and I turned her away. Her marriage to Thorne is a consequence of my failure, a failure you ensured I could not rectify by hiding her explanation." Charlotte's expression shifted from defensive to calculating. "But what can you do now? She's married. You are free. We could still—" "Get out," Edmund said flatly. "Leave my house. Leave my life. If I ever see you in society again, I will cut you completely. If you dare speak to me or mine, I will ensure every family in England knows exactly what you did. Your reputation, your prospects, everything you sacrificed Grace for, I will destroy it all." Charlotte stared at him in shock. "You cannot be serious. Over a woman who is married to another man? Edmund, be reasonable." "Out!" Edmund roared, his control finally snapping. "Before I forget, you are a woman, and have you thrown into the street like the manipulative villain you are." Charlotte fled, and Edmund stood in his study breathing hard, trying to master the tsunami of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had to see Grace, had to explain, apologize, beg forgiveness for his blindness and cruelty, had to somehow make amends for 7 months of suffering he had inflicted through ignorance. But Grace was married, legally bound to Victor Thorne, and Edmund had no right, no claim, no possibility of simply declaring his renewed love and expecting her to miraculously become available. His mother found him an hour later, still standing at his study window, Grace's letter clutched in his hand. "Edmund," the dowager said gently. "Carstairs mentioned there was some disturbance." Edmund handed her the letter wordlessly. The dowager read slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding to profound regret. "Oh, my dear boy," she whispered when she finished. "That poor girl. What she must have suffered." "Because of me," Edmund said hoarsely. "Because I was too proud to truly listen when she asked for help, too concerned with principle to see desperation. And then I punished her publicly for months, for a betrayal that existed only in my imagination. Because of Charlotte Waverley's manipulation," the dowager corrected firmly. "Do not absolve her of responsibility for her own cruel actions." "But the responsibility for helping Grace was mine," Edmund insisted. "She came to me. She trusted me, and I failed her." The dowager was quiet for a moment. Then, "What will you do now?" "I do not know," Edmund admitted. "She is married. Thorn may be a mercenary villain, but the marriage is legal. I cannot simply demand she leave him. I have no right to expect her forgiveness, let alone her renewed affection. Then perhaps, the Dowager suggested gently, you should ask her what she wants rather than deciding for her. Edmund departed for Bath that same day. He learned from Lady Ashford, Cordelia received him with frosty civility, that Grace had returned to Thorn's Somerset estate the previous week. Armed with the address, Edmund rode through the night, arriving at the imposing mansion as dawn broke. The Somerset estate was exactly as he expected, grand, expensive, devoid of warmth. A servant showed him to a sitting room and went to fetch the mistress of the house. Grace appeared 10 minutes later, her honey-blonde hair simply dressed, wearing a morning gown of pale blue. She looked thinner than he remembered, but there was a strength in her bearing that had not existed before. She saw him and stopped abruptly in the doorway. "Edmund," she whispered. "Grace," he replied, standing. "Forgive my intrusion. I received your letter. I needed to. There is so much I must—" He stopped, words failing utterly in the face of her presence. All his rehearsed speeches, his careful apologies, his explanations, none of it seemed adequate. Grace recovered first. "You should not be here. If Thorn discovers—" "Thorn is in London," Edmund interrupted. "I made inquiries, and I do not particularly care about his opinions regardless. Grace, I am so profoundly sorry for not helping you when you needed me, for not understanding the desperation of your circumstances, for the 7 months of contempt I subjected you to based on lies, for every moment of suffering I caused through my blindness and pride." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "You received my explanation then. You know about the intercepted letter." "I know everything," Edmund confirmed. "Lady Charlotte has been dealt with, my housekeeper has been dismissed, and I have spent the past 48 hours understanding the magnitude of my failures." "You did not fail me, Edmund," Grace said quietly. "I never should have expected you to solve my family's problems. Thomas's debt was not your responsibility." "But you were my responsibility," Edmund replied intensely. "You were going to be my wife. Your concerns should have been mine. Instead, I dismissed you with lectures about precedent and principle while you were drowning." Grace wiped at her tears. "Why are you here, Edmund? What do you hope to accomplish?" "I do not know," Edmund admitted honestly. "I know only that I spent 7 months hating you for something you did not do, that I caused you enormous suffering through my ignorance, and that I love you still, desperately, completely, regardless of every logical reason why I should not." Grace inhaled sharply. "I am married to another man." "I know," Edmund said, "which is why I am not demanding anything, not expecting anything. I'm simply telling you the truth because you deserve truth after so many months of lies. I love you, Grace. I never stopped. And if there is any possibility, any chance that your marriage to Thorn could be dissolved—" "Annulment," Grace interrupted softly. "The marriage was never consummated. Thorn has no interest in me as a wife, only as a social acquisition. Dr. Thornfield has connections to an excellent solicitor who specializes in such matters. I consulted him 3 weeks ago, before I even knew whether you would believe my letter." Edmund felt hope blaze to life, terrifying and overwhelming. "You were planning to leave him anyway?" "I was planning to free myself," Grace corrected. "Whether you believed me, whether you still cared, whether we could ever salvage anything, none of that factored into my decision. I simply realized I could not spend the rest of my life as Victor Thorn's property, living in elegant misery, sacrificing everything I am for a debt that has already been paid." "Then allow me to help," Edmund said urgently. "My solicitors are excellent. My resources are at your disposal. Whatever you need to free yourself from that marriage, whatever it costs, I will provide it." "And in exchange?" Grace asked carefully. "Nothing," Edmund replied. "No exchange, no conditions. This is not a transaction, Grace. This is me, finally, belatedly, providing the help I should have offered a year ago. You do not owe me anything. You need not consider my feelings or my hopes. I am offering assistance because you deserve to be free, regardless of what that freedom means for us." Grace studied him for a long moment, and Edmund saw her truly seeing him, assessing whether he had changed, whether he understood what he had done, whether the man she had loved still existed beneath 7 months of bitterness. "Very well," she finally said. "I accept your help. But Edmund, I need time. I need to become my own person again before I can consider being someone's wife. Too much has happened. Too much has broken. I cannot simply return to who we were." "I do not want you to," Edmund assured her. "The woman you have become, strong, independent, pursuing her scientific work, she is magnificent, Grace. I do not want to diminish that. I want to support it. And if that support is all you ever want from me, I will accept that." "But you hope for more," Grace said softly. "I hope," Edmund admitted, "for the privilege of courting you properly this time, for the opportunity to prove I have learned from my failures, for the possibility that someday, when you are ready, you might consider giving me a second chance I do not remotely deserve." Grace's tears spilled over. "You truly love me still? After everything?" "Grace," Edmund said, crossing the room to stand before her, not touching but close enough that she could feel his presence. "I never stopped. Even when I believed you had betrayed me. Even when I tried to convince myself I hated you. I loved you through all of it. That never changed." Grace reached up and touched his face gently, wonderingly. "I loved you through all of it too, even when I thought you had received my letter and simply did not care enough to act. Even when you cut me publicly again and again, I could not stop loving you." Edmund caught her hand and pressed a fierce kiss to her palm. "Then we shall find a way through this. However long it takes, whatever obstacles exist, we shall overcome them. Together," Grace whispered. "Together," Edmund confirmed. 6 months later, Grace's annulment was finalized. Victor Thorne, faced with evidence of his mercenary manipulation and threats of his business practices being exposed, had agreed to dissolve the marriage quietly. He returned to America shortly afterward, his attempt to infiltrate British aristocracy having failed spectacularly. Edmund courted Grace through those 6 months with patience and devotion. He attended her scientific lectures. He read her published botanical research with genuine appreciation. He introduced her to his parliamentary colleagues working on social reform. He treated her as an equal partner in conversations about philosophy, politics, and the future. And he never, not once, pressured her for commitment beyond what she was ready to offer. Grace, freed from the weight of her disastrous marriage, flourished. Her research gained recognition. The Royal Society invited her to present her findings. She maintained her close friendship with Elias Thornfield, who remained a supportive colleague, even as his own romantic attentions turned toward a fellow physician he had met through Grace's aunt's salon. And gradually, Grace and Edmund rediscovered what they had lost, but also built something new. Their love the second time was not the naive romance of their first courtship, but something deeper. Respect, understanding, partnership. They had both been broken by the previous year's trials. They had both learned painful lessons about communication, pride, and the cost of assumptions. And they had both emerged stronger, wiser, better equipped for true partnership. On a spring morning in May, Edmund proposed again. Not at a ball or in a dramatic garden, but in the library at Ashworth Manor, surrounded by botanical texts they had been studying together. "I have no expectation that you will say yes," he prefaced. "I know you value your independence, your work, your freedom. But I love you, Grace. I want to spend my life supporting your ambitions, celebrating your achievements, and building a future where we both flourish. Will you marry me?" Grace, who had already decided her answer months before, smiled through happy tears. "Yes, Edmund. On condition that you understand this marriage will be different from what society expects. I will continue my scientific research. I will publish under my own name. I will maintain intellectual partnerships regardless of gender. I will be your partner, not your ornament." "I would expect nothing less," Edmund replied, pulling her into his arms. You are Grace Bellamy, brilliant scientist, published researcher, woman of remarkable courage and strength. I'm merely hoping you will also consent to be Grace Ashworth, Duchess of Ashworth, while remaining entirely yourself." "Then I consent," Grace said, kissing him, "to all of it. To you, to us, to the future we will build together." They married in June, in the same cathedral where they would have wed 2 years earlier. But this time Grace walked the aisle not as a transaction or obligation, but as a woman choosing her own destiny. Her botanical illustrations were displayed throughout the church. Her scientific colleagues sat alongside aristocratic guests. And when Edmund spoke his vows, he added a line the Archbishop had not approved: "I promise to honor your mind as fully as your heart, to support your ambitions as zealously as my own, and to build a marriage of true partnership." Grace, never one to be outdone, added her own modification: "I promise to love you not for who I wished you to be, but for who you truly are. Flaws, failures, and extraordinary strengths alike. We have already survived the worst we could do to each other. Everything from here is triumph." The congregation did not entirely understand the unorthodox vows, but those who mattered did. Cordelia wept. Elias smiled. The Dowager Duchess nodded approval. And as Grace and Edmund departed the cathedral amid flower petals and celebration, she reflected on the extraordinary journey from public humiliation to scientific recognition, from sacrifice to freedom, from lost love to reclaimed future. The letter that had been intercepted had cost them a year of suffering, but perhaps, Grace thought as Edmund squeezed her hand, that suffering had been necessary. They had both needed to be broken down and rebuilt into people capable of true partnership. They had needed to learn hard lessons about communication, pride, and the cost of assumptions. Now they stood together, not as the naive young lovers they had been, but as two people who had faced the worst and emerged stronger. The Duke no longer despised her. The sacrifice had been revealed, and from the ashes of scandal and suffering, something genuinely beautiful had grown. As their carriage departed for Ashworth Manor and the beginning of their true life together, Grace whispered to Edmund, "Was it worth it? All the suffering, the loss, the pain?" Edmund considered seriously. "I would not choose that path again, but given where we are now, who we have become, I cannot regret it entirely. We earned this happiness, Grace, through fire and loss and painful growth that makes it precious beyond measure." Grace leaned against his shoulder, feeling at peace for the first time in 2 years. "Then let us ensure we never waste a moment of it." And they did not. The Duke and Duchess of Ashworth became known throughout England, not merely for their social standing, but for their intellectual partnership. Grace published extensively, became the first female fellow of the Royal Society, with Edmund's vigorous advocacy, and transformed Ashworth Manor's gardens into botanical research centre. Edmund championed social reform in Parliament, supported scientific education, and became known as the rare aristocrat whose word could be trusted absolutely. They had 5 children, all of whom were taught that intelligence mattered more than social convention, that integrity was worth any price, and that love, true, hard-won love, was the most valuable achievement of all. And every year on their anniversary, Grace and Edmund exchanged letters, honest, detailed communications about their hopes, fears, dreams, and love. They never again allowed assumption or pride to substitute for clear communication. The cost of that lesson had been too high to ever forget. The lost letter had revealed the sacrifice Grace made. But the found truth had revealed something even more important, that love strong enough to survive betrayal, suffering, and public contempt was also strong enough to build a lifetime of genuine partnership. And that, Grace thought on their 50th anniversary as she and Edmund walked through the gardens they had cultivated together, was the greatest triumph of all. If you've been listening to this story, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I'd love to know how far this story has traveled and what resonated most with you.